I've often found it the case that when you have a tool that is a multifunction tool that's designed to do a whole bunch of different things, it usually doesn't perform as well as a tool that's dedicated to a very specific process or task. But I have to say that soldering irons are kind of an exception to that rule as I know it. One of the reasons that I've chosen to talk about soldering irons is that they're relatively inexpensive to purchase and they have a wide range of applications. So back in the old days, soldering was used a lot for sealing seams on flat sheet metal pattern work with both zinc plated or galvanized sheet metal and also with copper. And today we're going to specifically look at soldering irons that use electricity as a source of energy, and we're going to look at how that works in the tool and how we can make some modifications to the general function of soldering irons to use it in a wider range of applications. So we are going to look a little bit about how we can use soldering irons to do wax welding for preparing patterns for casting in the foundry. We're going to talk a little bit about how we can make an accessory to go along with that soldering iron that is called a rheostat control that will allow us to decrease the amount of energy transferring through that tool to reduce the smoke that it generates so that the process is a little bit cleaner and safer to work with. We're going to look a little bit at how soldering irons have evolved to be adapted to use for wood burning or pyrography, and we'll do a little demonstration on pyrography using engineered materials like plywood, hardwoods, leather, and paper. Now, at its most fundamental level, a soldering iron is nothing more than a resistance heating tool. And what I mean by resistance heating is that as electricity or alternating current, which is the way that electricity comes out of the socket in the wall, the way that alternating current flowing through wires generates a resistance that in turn translates into generating heat. And most every soldering iron has a rating that helps us understand what its capacity for heat displacement is. So that measure of energy is called wattage, just like light bulbs have a measured wattage output. So here we have an old school soldering iron that was used for copper and sheet metal. This has a capacity of 100 watts, which is pretty heavy duty. But I have some other soldering irons that you'll see in the pictures I posted earlier in the week that generate up to 350 watts, which is a crazy amount of energy to be delivering through a hand tool. So anytime we're working with heat, we have concerns about the possible risk of contact burns. But additionally, we're really concerned about the kind of fumes that can be generated when we're working with things like petroleum products like wax, because we know the smoke from this is highly toxic. It may well also have to do with potential fumes that come off of engineered materials. For example, MDF, which typically is bonded with a urea formaldehyde glue, would put off extremely toxic fumes if you tried to wood burn that. And some tropical hardwoods also contain volatile oils that can generate highly toxic fumes when you're working with things like a wood burning or pyrographic pen. We're also going to do a little demonstration on wood burning on leather, but it's very important that you understand that the only leather that you should ever burn using pyrographic tools is vegetable tanned leather. Again, other leathers, like some engineered wood products, are treated with highly toxic chemicals that would be released when you introduce heat to them. So, we have energy input that comes in the form of a cord. We have an insulated handle to keep our hands cool. We have the resistance element, which the heat is stored in. And we have an interchangeable nib that can be swapped out to different point sizes and styles. So in this little professional wonder pen kit here, you can see that they tout that it's effective for use on wood, leather, cork, plastic, tile, and silk, as well as velvet. But again, I would never, ever, ever want to be burning a plastic unless I had positive ventilation in the space that I was working and an appropriate respirator to work with. And mind you, plastic welding is becoming a pretty common practice in the world of what soldering irons are capable of, but it's not something we would do without the appropriate ventilation. So for today's demo, we're going to look at how different nibs can be used for different mark making on the surface of our materials. We're going to look at this fancy version of a pyrographic pen that incorporates a rheostatic control that allows us to increase or decrease the amount of energy that's being distributed through the system. And we'll see how increasing or decreasing that energy output affects both line weight and line penetration. So with that said, let the burning begin. Pyrography has been around for a long time, and I can tell you that when I was a little kid, I can remember getting a little kit like this professional wonder pen with additional points that you see right here. And under the little guarantee card, it says, "This certifies that this electric wonder pen has been thoroughly inspected and is guaranteed against defect." But the fact of the matter is that any time that we're going to use a tool, we should do a quick inspection of that tool in advance of using it. This is especially true when you're working with electricity. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do just a very brief inspection of the tool, which includes carefully examining the cord to make sure there's no cracks or breaks exposing bare wire. On that cord, I'm going to look at the plug and make sure that the plug is sound and secure and no obvious evidence of damage or cracking. These tools have very little that can go wrong with them, but the prolonged exposure to heat will cause the plastic that makes up the cord to become fatigued and start to break down. So, and with old plastic cords, you just bend them and you can hear them crack and sometimes see the plastic spalling right off of or peeling off of the electrical wire, the copper wire that is sheathed inside of that plastic. So it's very important that we inspect any tool in advance of using it to make sure that it's in good working order. This particular soldering iron is what's called a solid point, and they typically operate at a fixed temperature energy output. This particular one is rated at 18 watts, which is very low output, but it's enough energy to be able to do things like you see in this practice plaque that came along with this kit manufactured by the American Toy and Furniture Company right here in Chicago, Illinois, before they actually used zip codes. And you can see that somebody had their fun going around and following the lines and burning in over the top of an existing drawing. And I can tell you that most typically when I'm doing wood burning, I am going to go ahead and draw out my pattern in advance in pencil so that I've got lines or guides to follow. It's also important to understand that the longer you hold it in one place, the more heat it's going to input into that location. So that means the deeper and the wider the mark will be on the surface. So this particular model came with a series of different types of tips for different types of drawing and mark making. So by mark making, I mean that literally you would be taking something like this nib and stamping a series of overlapping patterns to create a pattern or texture on the surface of our work. And when we fire this up, we'll take a little bit of a look at how that translates to the different materials that we're working with. Now, as cute as this is, and as much as I love vintage tools, I was thrilled when Pyrography took a massive leap forward by introducing a different type of pen, and these pens are called wire nib pens. So they're not solid, they're made out of wire. And this particular pen is called a skew. So it's good for cross-hatching, and it's pretty good for doing some light line work. And this particular nib is a classic drawing nib. These pens are connected to the rheostat control, which is with what's called an RCA cord. So one end of the cord goes into my pen, the other end of the cord goes into the unit. Controlling how much energy is being input into that tool guarantees a couple of things. One is that we're able to get a range of line quality and line weight, but it also helps preserve that wire nib, which is kind of expensive to replace, but it extends the life of that wire nib so that you can get a lot of use out of it. Excessive heat input into that wire nib ends up burning them out prematurely. So the general rule of thumb is that I never want to see that glowing bright red. Right? So I'm starting out with a setting around 7, and then I'm going to do some little mark making test on a piece of scrap. Probably be helpful if I turn the unit on. Oh, Lord. Let's give that another go.